You feel your soul being eroded by the constant pressures of modern life, endless demands, toxic relationships, and a world that seems designed to steal your inner peace. Every day you wake up feeling disconnected from your true self, watching others maintain their composure while you struggle with anxiety, anger, and a deep sense that you're losing who you're meant to be. I am Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who maintained unshakable inner strength while bearing the weight of the Roman Empire and facing plagues, wars, and betrayals that would crush ordinary men. The 10 sacred laws from my meditations will transform your soul from a battlefield of chaos into a fortress of unbreakable peace, using the same Stoic principles that sustained me through humanity's darkest hours. These aren't mere philosophical concepts, they are the soul-forging practices that can restore your connection to your highest self and grant you the serenity that comes from true wisdom. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless Stoic wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready for spiritual transformation. I never wanted to be emperor. When Antoninus Pius adopted me as his heir, I felt the weight of the world crushing down upon my shoulders like a mountain of lead. I was a philosopher at heart, someone who found peace in contemplating the nature of existence, not in commanding legions or making decisions that would affect millions of lives. Yet fate, or perhaps the gods, had other plans for me. The purple cloak of imperial power felt like chains around my soul. Every morning, I would wake in my tent on the Germanic frontier, listening to the sounds of my army stirring to life, and I would feel the crushing responsibility of it all. These men looked to me for leadership, for decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. Behind me in Rome, senators schemed and plotted, while common citizens struggled with plagues, famines, and the countless sufferings that flesh is heir to dot. In those early years of my reign, I was drowning. The external pressures were relentless barbarian invasions on multiple fronts, political intrigue in the capital, natural disasters that tested the empire's resources. But what nearly destroyed me wasn't the external chaos. It was the internal storm. My mind raced constantly with worries, fears, and the endless weight of decisions. I would lie awake at night, consumed by anxiety about whether I had made the right choice in battle, whether my policies would benefit or harm the people, whether I was worthy of the trust placed in me. It was during my darkest hour, camped along the Danube River while rain pounded my tent and the screams of wounded soldiers echoed through the night, that I discovered the practice that would save my soul. I began writing to myself, not official documents or correspondence, but intimate conversations with my own spirit. I called these my meditations, though they were really letters to my better self, reminders of what truly mattered when everything around me seemed to be falling apart. In these private moments with my scroll and stylus, I began to understand something profound. I could not control the barbarians at our gates, the scheming senators, the plagues, or the natural disasters. But I could control one thing: my own mind, my own responses, my own character. This revelation didn't come all at once like lightning striking. It emerged slowly, like dawn breaking over a battlefield. As I wrote night after night, examining my thoughts and challenging my assumptions about what it meant to be strong, to be successful, to be truly alive, I realized that true power wasn't in commanding others, but in commanding myself. Real strength wasn't in conquering territory, but in conquering my own destructive emotions. The empire I needed to rule first was the empire within my own soul, and until I mastered that realm, I would always be a slave to circumstances. No matter how many legions followed my commands, this is when my real education began, not in the schools of Athens or the libraries of Rome, but in the harsh classroom of experience, where Stoic philosophy became not just intellectual exercise, but daily survival. The 10 laws I discovered didn't come from books alone, but from the crucible of leadership, from facing death in battle, from watching good men die for causes they believed in, from making decisions when there was no perfect choice available. Each law was forged in the fire of real experience, tested against the hardest challenges a human soul can face, and proven worthy through years of practice. They transformed me from an anxious, overwhelmed young ruler into someone who could find peace in the storm, strength in adversity, and meaning in suffering. Asterisk, asterisk, the first law I discovered changed everything. You are the absolute ruler of your inner citadel, and no external force can breach those walls without your permission. This realization came to me during the siege of Carnuntum, when barbarian hordes surrounded our fortress for weeks. As I watched our stone walls hold against their assault, I understood that my mind possessed the same impenetrable strength if I chose to fortify it properly. I had spent months believing that my inner peace depended on external circumstances. When battles went well, I felt strong. When senators criticized my policies, I felt inadequate. When plague ravaged our cities, I felt helpless. I was letting every outside event dictate my internal state, making myself a slave to forces beyond my control. But in that moment of clarity, watching arrows bounce harmlessly off our fortress walls, I realized that my thoughts, my emotions, my very soul could be just as protected. The barbarians could scream and rage outside our walls, but they could not touch what we protected within. Similarly, criticism, setbacks, even tragedies could assault the perimeter of my consciousness, but they could only enter my inner sanctum if I opened the gates myself. This was not about becoming cold or unfeeling. It was about becoming sovereign. Over my own responses, I began practicing this sovereignty daily. When reports came of military defeats, instead of immediately descending into despair, I would pause and ask myself, what part of this can I control? What response serves my highest good? When senators whispered behind my back about my philosophical interests, rather than burning with anger or self-doubt, I would retreat to my inner citadel and remind myself that their opinions could not diminish my worth unless I allowed it. This practice required constant vigilance. Just as a fortress needs sentries posted at every entrance, I learned to post guardians at the gates of my mind. These guardians would examine every thought, every emotion, every reaction before allowing entry. Worry about tomorrow. Halt, you. Have no business here. Tomorrow is not yet real. Regret about yesterday. Stop. The past is beyond change. You serve no purpose here. Anger at circumstances beyond my control. Turn back. You only weaken this citadel's defenses. The most profound discovery was that this inner fortress was not built through force or suppression, but through understanding. I did not deny painful emotions or difficult thoughts, simply refused to let them rule me. Pain could visit my citadel, but it could not occupy the throne. Fear could knock at my gates, but it could not command my armies. This sovereignty became my greatest source of strength. During the Antonine Plague, when death surrounded us and despair filled the air, I remained calm, not because I felt no grief, but because I chose my responses consciously. When my adopted brother, Lucius Verus, died unexpectedly, I mourned deeply. But I did not let grief make my decisions for me. The external storm could rage, but within my citadel, I maintained order. The practice is simple, but not easy. Begin each day by reminding yourself that you are the emperor of your own consciousness. Throughout the day, notice when external events attempt to dictate your inner state, and consciously choose your response instead of reacting automatically. End each day by examining what gained unauthorized entry to your citadel, and strengthen your defenses for tomorrow. Your inner citadel is the one realm where you hold absolute power. Guard it well, for from this fortress you can weather any storm. Asterisk, asterisk, the second law emerged from the most terrifying teacher I ever encountered, death itself. When the Antonine Plague swept through our empire like an invisible army, claiming one. In 4 lives, I learned that death is not the enemy of a meaningful life, it is its greatest instructor. This lesson came at a terrible price, but it transformed my soul in ways that no victory or achievement ever could. I remember standing in a makeshift hospital in Rome, surrounded by the dying and the dead, watching physicians helplessly tend to patients whose fate was already sealed. The smell of burning bodies filled the air outside, and the sounds of mourning echoed through every street. In that moment of absolute horror, death whispered its most profound teaching, because I am inevitable. Every moment you waste in trivial concerns is a moment stolen from your true purpose. Before the plague, I had lived as most people do, assuming tomorrow was guaranteed, postponing important conversations, delaying acts of kindness, focusing on petty grievances and minor inconveniences as if they were matters of cosmic importance. Death stripped away these illusions with surgical precision. When I watched good men die in agony, I realized how precious and fleeting every breath truly was. I began each morning with a meditation I called Memento Mori, remember you must die. This was not morbid obsession, but practical wisdom. By acknowledging my mortality, I clarified my priorities instantly. The senator who criticized my policies seemed less threatening when I remembered that both he and I would be dust within decades. The setback that frustrated me in the afternoon lost its power when I considered how insignificant it would seem from my deathbed. Death taught me that most of our fears are illusions. We fear embarrassment, failure, loss of status, but the dying fear only one thing, that they wasted their time on earth. I saw wealthy merchants on their deathbeds, weeping not for their lost fortunes, but for the relationships they had neglected. I watched proud generals dying with regret, not for battles lost, but for moments of kindness left unex precious. This awareness transformed every interaction. When my wife Faustina and I disagreed, instead of nursing wounded pride, I would ask myself, if one of us dies tomorrow, will this argument matter? What words would I regret not speaking? When faced with difficult decisions, I would project myself to my final hour and ask, what choice would I be proud to remember in my dying moments? The plague also revealed death's most paradoxical gift. By accepting our mortality completely, we become truly alive. Once I stopped fighting the reality of death, I stopped wasting energy on impossible battles. Instead of raging against the limitation of human life, I embraced it. A flower's beauty comes partly from its brevity would. We cherish spring if it lasted forever. I developed a daily practice of imagining this was my last day on earth, not to create anxiety, but to create clarity. What would I choose to do if I knew I would die at sunset? How would I treat my servants, my advisors, my family? What thoughts would I allow to occupy my mind? This exercise never failed to reveal what truly mattered and what was mere distraction. Death also became my counselor in times of suffering. When physical pain racked my body during long campaigns, I would remember that this body was temporary. Anyway, a borrowed garment, I would eventually return. When emotional pain threatened to overwhelm me, I would consider how brief this lifetime was in the scope of eternity, and how little sense it made to spend it in anguish. The dying taught me their final wisdom, that a life lived with awareness of mortality is a life lived with unprecedented intensity and purpose. Every sunrise becomes a gift. Every conversation becomes an opportunity. Every choice becomes sacred because we know our chances are numbered. Embrace death as your teacher, and life will become your masterpiece. The third law shattered every assumption I held about success and happiness. Virtue alone is good, and everything else, wealth, power, pleasure, even health, is merely indifferent. This realization came to me during the height of my power, when I possessed everything the world considers valuable, yet felt spiritually empty. I discovered that I had been chasing shadows, while ignoring the only treasure that could never be taken from me. As emperor, I commanded the greatest military force on earth, controlled vast treasures, enjoyed luxuries beyond imagination, and wielded power that could reshape nations. Yet, in my private moments, I felt a gnawing dissatisfaction, a sense that despite having everything, I possessed nothing of real worth. I watched wealthy senators spend fortunes on temporary pleasures while remaining miserable. I saw powerful generals conquer territories but lose their own souls to corruption and cruelty. The breakthrough came when I witnessed a simple act of extraordinary virtue. During a particularly harsh winter campaign, I watched one of my soldiers, a man who owned nothing but his armor and weapons, give his only warm cloak to a dying enemy prisoner. This soldier had no wealth, no status, no power by worldly standards. He was nothing. Yet in that moment, he demonstrated something that all my imperial riches could not buy: perfect goodness. I realized that this common soldier possessed something infinitely more valuable than my crown, my treasures, or my armies. He had virtue, and virtue could never be stolen by thieves, destroyed by fire, or seized by enemies. While external goods could be lost in an instant, virtue belonged to the soul itself and remained constant regardless of circumstances. This understanding revolutionized my relationship with everything I owned. My imperial wealth became a tool to practice virtue, not a source of identity or happiness. When floods destroyed granaries in Egypt, I used imperial resources to provide relief, not because the gold made me good, but because generosity expressed the virtue within me. When faced with rebellious governors, I chose justice over expedience, not because justice was profitable, but because it aligned with my soul's true nature. I began distinguishing between what I truly owned and what I merely controlled. I controlled armies, but I owned my courage. I controlled territories, but I owned my wisdom. I controlled vast wealth, but I owned my integrity. The things I controlled could be taken by fate, force, or time, but the things I owned belonged to me eternally. This principle transformed my approach to loss and gain. When the plague reduced imperial revenues, I felt no anxiety because my worth was not measured in gold. When political enemies spread lies about my character, I felt no rage because their words could not touch my actual virtue. When age began weakening my body, I felt no despair because my true strength lay in my character, not my physical power. I discovered that virtue creates a different kind of pleasure, deeper and more lasting than any sensual indulgence. The satisfaction I felt after showing mercy to a defeated enemy exceeded any pleasure from the finest wine. The peace that came from speaking truth in difficult circumstances surpassed any comfort from luxurious surroundings. The joy of acting with perfect justice outshone any entertainment from theaters or games. This law also revealed the futility of envying others' external advantages. When I saw younger men with stronger bodies, I felt no jealousy because their physical gifts could not make them better people. When I encountered those with greater wealth, I felt no inferiority because their riches could not purchase virtue. The only quality worth envying was goodness itself, and this was available to every human being, regardless of circumstances. I developed a daily practice of examining my actions and motivations through virtue's lens. Did I speak truthfully today? Did I act with justice? Did I show appropriate courage? Did I exercise proper self-discipline? These questions mattered far more than whether I had gained or lost territory, wealth, or popular approval. The ultimate freedom came from realizing that virtue made me truly wealthy regardless of external poverty, truly powerful regardless of political weakness, truly successful regardless of worldly failure. A virtuous pauper was richer than a corrupt king. A just slave was freer than a tyrannical emperor. This law challenges you to examine what you truly value. Strip away society's definitions of success and ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be? The answer to that question reveals your path to unshakable happiness. The fourth law unveiled the most powerful secret I ever discovered. Your thoughts do not merely describe reality, they create it. This revelation came during my darkest hour, when barbarian tribes had formed an unprecedented alliance against Rome, and military advisors whispered that the empire might fall. In that moment of apparent catastrophe, I learned that the same external event could be either devastating defeat or glorious opportunity, depending entirely on how my mind chose to frame it. I had always believed that thoughts were simply observations, that when I looked at a military setback and felt despair, the despair was the natural result of the circumstances. But as I sat in my command tent, studying battle reports that painted a grim picture, I began questioning this assumption. Why did the same news that filled my generals with panic actually energize me with possibilities? The facts were identical, but our internal experiences were completely different. The breakthrough came when I realized that between any event and my emotional response lay a crucial step that I had been unconscious of: interpretation. The barbarian alliance was not inherently good or bad, it simply was. My mind, however, immediately began telling stories about what it meant. One story said, "This proves I am a failed emperor who has led Rome to destruction." Another story said, "This is the perfect opportunity to demonstrate Roman superiority against overwhelming odds." I began experimenting with this power deliberately. When scouts reported enemy reinforcements arriving, instead of automatically thinking "this makes victory impossible," I would consciously reframe it. This gives us a chance to defeat multiple tribes in one decisive battle. When supply lines were disrupted, instead of thinking we are doomed to starve, I would consider this is an opportunity to demonstrate Roman resilience and resourcefulness. The results were immediate and startling. When I changed my interpretation of events, my emotional state transformed completely. When my emotions shifted, my decision-making improved dramatically. When my decisions improved, the actual outcomes began changing in our favor. I was literally thinking my way to different realities. This principle extended far beyond military campaigns. When senators criticized my philosophical interests, I had previously thought, "They see me as weak and impractical." This interpretation generated shame and defensive anger, which led to poor responses that actually made me appear weak. When I reframed their criticism as, "They are giving me valuable feedback about how to communicate philosophy more effectively," I felt curious and grateful instead, which led to better relationships and more influence. I discovered that most human suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the stories we tell ourselves about events. A soldier who loses his leg in battle can think, "I am now useless and pitiful," and create a reality of misery and dependence. The same soldier can think, "I have given my body in service to something greater than myself, and now I must find new ways to contribute," and create a reality of purpose and continued meaning. The practice became a form of mental alchemy, transforming the base metal of raw experience into the gold of wisdom and growth. When I received news of my adoptive father's death, instead of only thinking I have lost my mentor and guide, I also thought, I now have the opportunity to honor his teachings through my own leadership. Both thoughts were true, but the second one empowered me to act constructively during grief. I learned to examine my automatic thought patterns like a physician examining symptoms. When I noticed thoughts of victimhood, helplessness, or despair, I would trace them back to their interpretive roots and ask, is this the only way to understand this situation? What other meanings are possible? Which interpretation serves my highest good and the good of those I lead? This law requires vigilance because the mind defaults to habitual thinking patterns. Most people unconsciously choose interpretations that confirm their existing beliefs about themselves and the world. If they believe life is unfair, they will interpret every setback as evidence of cosmic injustice. If they believe they are unlucky, they will frame every challenge as proof of their curse. But once you understand that you are the author of your own mental story, you can begin writing a different narrative. You can choose to see obstacles as training, setbacks as redirection, and even failures as necessary education. This is not denial or false optimism, is the recognition that reality is complex enough to support multiple valid interpretations, and wisdom lies in choosing the interpretation that serves life. Your thoughts are the architects of your experience. Build carefully. Asterisk. The fifth law demanded that I confront my most dangerous enemy, not the barbarian tribes at our borders, but the rage that burned within my own heart. For years, I had believed that anger was a sign of strength, a righteous response to injustice, a necessary fuel for decisive action. I was wrong. Anger, I discovered, is the enemy of wisdom, the destroyer of relationships, and the poison that weakens everything it touches, especially the one who harbors it. My awakening to anger's true nature came during a betrayal that shook me to my core. Avidius Cassius, one of my most trusted generals, declared himself emperor while I was campaigning in the north. When news reached me that my own appointee was claiming my throne and turning my eastern legions against me, I felt a rage so pure and consuming that it frightened me with its intensity. I wanted to march immediately to Syria and crush this rebellion with maximum brutality, but something stopped me in that moment of white-hot fury. I realized that my anger, however justified it felt, was making me stupid. In my rage, I was ready to make decisions that would damage the empire, waste Roman lives, and potentially start a civil war that could destroy everything I had worked to build. The man who had betrayed me was controlling my emotions, and through my emotions, he was controlling my choices. I was giving him power over me that I had never consciously granted. I began studying my anger like a physician studies a disease. What I discovered disturbed me deeply. Anger promised strength but delivered weakness. It promised clarity but created confusion. It promised justice but usually led to injustice. When I was angry, my judgment became clouded. My words became weapons that wounded unnecessarily, and my actions became reactions rather than conscious choices. I watched anger destroy other leaders around me. Senators who could have been allies became enemies because angry words were spoken in heated moments. Generals who should have been promoted were passed over because they had shown poor judgment during episodes of rage. Marriages that could have been partnerships became battlegrounds because spouses could not control their tempers. The most painful realization was that anger never actually solved the problems it claimed to address. When I raged at incompetent administrators, they became more fearful and less effective, not more competent. When I expressed fury at military setbacks, my officers became defensive and less likely to report problems honestly. Anger created the very conditions it pretended to fix. I developed a new understanding. Anger is always a secondary emotion. Beneath the rage lies something more vulnerable: fear, disappointment, or a sense of powerlessness. The angry person is often a frightened person wearing a mask of aggression. When Cassius betrayed me, my anger was masking my fear that I had failed as a leader and my hurt that someone I trusted had rejected me. Instead of feeding my rage against Cassius, I began addressing the underlying emotions. I acknowledged my fear honestly, examined what his rebellion might teach me about my leadership, and considered how to respond in a way that would strengthen rather than damage the empire. This process led me to an extraordinary decision. When Cassius was assassinated by his own men before I could reach Syria, I pardoned all his followers and welcomed them back into imperial service. This response shocked everyone, including myself. Had I acted from anger, I would have crucified the rebels and created a legacy of fear and resentment. By mastering my anger, I created loyalty where there had been betrayal and turned potential enemies into grateful allies. The strength, I thought, anger would give me was nothing compared to the power I found in calm, reasoned response. I learned to recognize anger's early warning signs: the tightening of my jaw, the acceleration of my heartbeat, the narrowing of my vision to focus only on the offense. When I noticed these signals, I would pause and ask myself, what is this anger trying to protect? What fear or hurt is it defending? How can I address the real issue without letting rage take control? The practice became one of strategic patience. Instead of reacting immediately to provocations, I would give myself time to cool down and think clearly. I discovered that most situations that triggered anger looked completely different after a few hours of reflection. Problems that seemed to demand immediate retaliation often resolved themselves when approached with patience and wisdom. This law does not mean becoming passive or accepting injustice. It means choosing your responses consciously rather than letting emotions choose for you. A calm leader who addresses problems systematically is far more effective than an angry leader who lashes out impulsively. Strength lies not in the ability to hurt others when provoked, but in the ability to remain centered and wise regardless of provocation. True power is the power over yourself, and anger is the thief that steals that power. Guard your inner peace more carefully than you guard your treasures. The sixth law emerged from the most unexpected source: my enemies themselves. While fighting Germanic tribes along the frontier, I began to see something that changed my understanding of human nature forever. Beneath the surface differences of language, culture, and allegiance, all people share the same fundamental essence. This realization transformed not only how I conducted warfare, but how I understood my place in the vast web of human existence. I remember the moment this truth crystallized. After a particularly brutal battle, I walked among the fallen on both sides, Roman soldiers and Germanic warriors lying side by side in death. In the pale moonlight, stripped of their armor and tribal markings, they looked remarkably similar. The same basic features, the same vulnerable mortality, the same evidence of lives lived with hopes, fears, and loves. I realized that the barbarian who had tried to kill me hours earlier was someone's son, perhaps someone's father, driven by the same protective instincts that motivated my own soldiers. This recognition could have been merely sentimental, but it became practical wisdom when I understood its deeper implications. If all humans share this common essence, then the conflicts between us are largely artificial, created by circumstances, misunderstandings, and competing needs rather than fundamental incompatibility. This meant that many problems I had been trying to solve through force might be better addressed through understanding. I began applying this principle in my dealings with conquered peoples. Instead of simply imposing Roman will through dominance, I started asking, what do these people need that we might provide? What do they value that we might respect? How can we create mutual benefit rather than mere subjugation? This approach proved far more effective than pure conquest. Tribes that could have been permanent enemies became willing allies when treated with dignity and offered genuine partnership. The same principle revolutionized my relationships within the empire. When senators opposed my policies, instead of Seeing them as obstacles to overcome, I began viewing them as fellow Romans with legitimate concerns that deserved consideration. This shift in perspective led to better legislation, stronger consensus, and more effective governance. By acknowledging our shared humanity, I discovered that apparent enemies could become collaborative partners. I realized that much of human suffering comes from artificial separation, the illusion that we are fundamentally different from and opposed to one another. This separation breeds fear, and fear breeds conflict. When I saw Germanic warriors as inherently evil barbarians, I felt justified in any cruelty toward them. When I recognized them as fellow humans caught in difficult circumstances, I felt compelled to seek solutions that honored everyone's dignity. This law also explained why isolation was so psychologically damaging. Humans are naturally social creatures, designed for connection and mutual support. When we cut ourselves off from others, whether through pride, fear, or philosophical superiority, we wound our own souls. I had spent years believing that imperial power required emotional distance from my subjects, but I discovered that effective leadership actually required deeper connection and understanding. I began practicing what I called universal sympathy, the deliberate cultivation of goodwill toward all people, regardless of their relationship to me. When facing difficult individuals, I would remind myself, this person is doing what they believe is best based on their understanding and circumstances. They are driven by the same basic needs for security, respect, and meaning that drive me. How can I address their underlying needs while also serving the greater good? This practice extended even to those who actively opposed me. When rebels or criminals were brought before me for judgment, I would look for the human motivation behind their actions. Often, I found that crime and rebellion arose from desperation, injustice, or misguided attempts to meet legitimate needs. Understanding this allowed me to craft responses that addressed root causes rather than simply punishing symptoms. The connection principle also revealed my responsibility toward others. If we are all part of the same human family, then the suffering of any person diminishes me, and the elevation of any person enriches me. This meant that using my imperial power solely for personal benefit was not just morally wrong, it was spiritually self-destructive. True prosperity could only come from contributing to the common good. I developed a daily practice of explicitly recognizing my connection to others. When I met with advisors, I would silently acknowledge this person, and I share the same fundamental nature and the same basic needs. When I heard reports of suffering in distant provinces, I would remind myself, these are my family members in the largest sense, and their welfare is connected to mine. This practice dissolved much of the loneliness and burden that had characterized my early years as emperor. The most profound discovery was that this connection was not just philosophical theory, but practical reality. The better I treated others, the better my own life became. The more I served the common good, the more personally fulfilled I felt. The more I recognized others' dignity, the more dignified my own life became. We truly are interconnected, and acting from this understanding benefits everyone, including ourselves. You are not alone in this world, struggling against hostile forces. You are part of a vast human family, and your well-being is connected to everyone else's in ways both visible and invisible. The seventh law saved my sanity and possibly my life. The fundamental distinction between what lies within your control and what lies beyond it. This principle became my anchor during the storms of imperial responsibility, when the weight of managing an empire threatened to crush my spirit under the impossible burden of trying to control everything and everyone around me. The lesson came through brutal experience during the Great Plague that devastated our empire. Each morning, I would receive reports of thousands of new deaths, entire cities emptying, trade collapsing, and social order breaking down. My initial response was to frantically issue commands to address every aspect of the crisis: physicians, distributing food, maintaining military readiness, reassuring the population. I exhausted myself trying to control a pandemic that followed no human timeline or logic. The breaking point came when I collapsed from exhaustion in my study, surrounded by scrolls containing impossible demands and unsolvable problems. In that moment of complete overwhelm, I realized I was attempting something that no human being could accomplish, controlling forces far beyond my power. The plague would run its course, regardless of my worry. People would die despite my best efforts. The economy would suffer no matter how many edicts I issued. But in that same moment of despair, I discovered something liberating. While I could not control the plague itself, I could control my response to it. I could not prevent all deaths, but I could ensure that imperial resources reached those who needed them most. I could not eliminate fear from the population, but I could model calm leadership that inspired confidence. I could not stop the disease, but I could control how I faced this crisis. I began making lists of practice that became essential to my daily routine. In one column, I wrote everything I could not control: other people's actions, natural disasters, the past, the future, death, illness, the opinions others held of me. In another column, I wrote what I could control: my own actions, my responses to events, my effort, my attitude, my choices, my character, my priorities. The first list was always longer, which initially frustrated me, but gradually I realized this was liberating rather than limiting. Most of my anxiety and anger came from trying to control items from the first list. When I focused my energy exclusively on the second list, I became far more effective and infinitely more peaceful. This principle transformed my approach to military campaigns. Previously, I had tormented myself over factors beyond my control: weather conditions, enemy movements, supply problems caused by terrain. I would lie awake strategizing responses to situations that might never occur. When I learned to focus only on what I could influence: troop training, strategic planning, resource allocation, my own decision-making process, I became a more effective commander and slept much better. The same principle revolutionized my political relationships. I had wasted enormous energy trying to control Senna's opinions, attempting to force consensus where none existed, and becoming frustrated when people disagreed with my policies. When I accepted that I could only control my own proposals, arguments, and behavior, not others' responses to them, my became more persuasive and less stressed. I discovered that this distinction applied to every area of life. I could not control whether my wife loved me, but I could control how lovingly I treated her. I could not control whether my policies succeeded, but I could control how thoughtfully I developed them. I could not control whether I would be remembered as a great emperor, but I could control whether I acted with virtue each day. The practice became a form of spiritual discipline. Whenever I felt anxiety, anger, or frustration, I would ask myself, what am I trying to control that is actually beyond my power? The answer almost always revealed the source of my suffering. I was attempting to manage outcomes that belonged to fate, other people, or natural forces, rather than focusing on my own responses and choices. This law also revealed the futility of blame and resentment. When subordinates disappointed me, I could not control their past actions, but I could control how I addressed the situation going forward. When enemies attacked our positions, I could not control their aggression, but I could control our defensive preparations and response strategies. When natural disasters struck the empire, I could not control the destruction, but I could control our relief efforts. The most profound application came in dealing with my own mortality and legacy. I could not control how long I would live or how history would judge me, but I could control how I spent the time I had and what example I set while alive. This realization freed me from the anxiety that had plagued many emperors, the desperate attempt to control their posthumous reputation through monuments and propaganda. I developed a simple daily practice. At the end of each day, I would review my actions and concerns, asking myself whether I had wasted energy on things beyond my control. When I caught myself worrying about uncontrollables, I would redirect that energy toward actions I could actually take. This practice gradually retrained my mind to naturally focus on what was within my power. The ultimate freedom comes from understanding that you are responsible for your choices and responses, but not for outcomes beyond your influence. This responsibility is not a burden, it is the foundation of all genuine power and peace. Pour your energy into what you can control, and let everything else flow according to its nature. The eighth law forced me to confront my deepest fear, the inevitability of change. For years, I had unconsciously been fighting against the natural order, trying to preserve what I loved, prevent what I dreaded, and maintain stability in a universe designed for constant transformation. This resistance created tremendous suffering, until I learned to see change not as an enemy to be defeated, but as nature's fundamental rhythm to be embraced. My education in this law began with personal loss. When my adopted father, Antoninus Pius, died, I felt as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. He had been my mentor, my guide, my model of what it meant to rule with wisdom and compassion. His death left me feeling abandoned and unprepared for the enormous responsibilities that suddenly fell upon my shoulders. I raged against the unfairness of losing him when I needed him most. But as I stood beside his funeral pyre, watching the flames consume his physical form, I began to understand something profound about the nature of existence. The fire was not destroying Antoninus, it was simply changing his form, returning his elements to the earth and air from which they had come. He had always been part of the eternal cycle of transformation. Death was merely the next phase of that cycle, not an interruption of it. This realization led me to observe change everywhere around me. Seasons followed their eternal pattern, each one beautiful in its own way, each one necessary for the health of the whole. Rivers carved new channels through rock, creating landscapes of stunning beauty through their patient persistence. Even the empire itself was constantly changing, new territories added, old customs evolving, fresh challenges requiring novel solutions. I began to see that my resistance to change was like trying to stop a river with my bare hands. The river would continue flowing regardless of my efforts, but my resistance would exhaust me and create turbulence where there could be smooth current. When I learned to move with the river instead of against it, I discovered that change could carry me toward destinations I never could have reached through my own efforts. This principle transformed my approach to military campaigns. Previously, when battle plans went awry or unexpected obstacles arose, I would become frustrated and try to force events back to my original strategy. I learned instead to adapt fluidly to changing circumstances, using unexpected developments as opportunities to discover better approaches. Some of my greatest victories came from embracing changes that initially seemed like disasters. The same flexibility revolutionized my leadership style. When the plague disrupted normal governance, instead of insisting on traditional procedures, I developed new systems that were more appropriate to the crisis. When economic pressures required adjustments to imperial policy, I embraced these changes as chances to improve our systems, rather than viewing them as unwelcome deviations from established practice. I discovered that change was not only inevitable, but beneficial. Stagnation, not change, was the true enemy of growth and vitality. A plant that stopped growing would die. A mind that resisted new ideas would become rigid and useless. An empire that refused to evolve would be conquered by more adaptable rivals. Change was life expressing its essential creativity. This understanding helped me deal with aging and physical decline. As my body grew weaker and my hair turned grey, I could have mourned the loss of youth and strength. Instead, I began appreciating the different gifts that came with each life phase. The vigor of youth was being replaced by the wisdom of experience. The passion of young manhood was evolving into the deeper satisfaction of mature understanding. I developed practices for embracing change consciously. Each morning, I would remind myself that everything I saw around me, including my own body and circumstances, was in constant flux. This awareness helped me appreciate present moments more fully, knowing they would never come again in exactly the same form. It also helped me prepare mentally for inevitable changes, so I would be ready to adapt when they arrived. The most challenging application was learning to let go of attachment to specific outcomes. I had to release my grip on how I thought situations should unfold, and trust that whatever emerged would contain its own opportunities and lessons. This did not mean becoming passive or fatalistic, but rather putting forth my best effort while remaining open to results different from my expectations. I learned to see change as a teacher rather than a threat. Every transition contained valuable lessons about impermanence, adaptation, and resilience. Losses taught me about the preciousness of what remained. Gains taught me about gratitude and responsibility. Unexpected developments taught me about flexibility and creativity. The ultimate wisdom was recognizing that I myself was part of nature's constant transformation. My thoughts, emotions, circumstances, and relationships were all subject to change, and this was not a flaw in the system, but its essential beauty. Like a river constantly flowing, yet always itself, I could maintain my essential identity, while allowing everything else to evolve naturally. Resistance to change is resistance to life itself. When you align yourself with transformation, you align yourself with the creative force that drives the entire universe. Flow with change, and it will carry you to shores you never imagined possible. Asterisk, asterisk. The ninth law became my refuge in the storm of imperial chaos. This present moment is the only time that truly belongs to you. Everything else, past and future, exists only in your mind, while real life unfolds exclusively in the eternal now. This understanding transformed me from a man haunted by regrets and paralyzed by anxieties into someone who could find peace and power in any circumstance. The revelation came during one of the darkest periods of my reign, when multiple crises converged simultaneously. Germanic tribes were pressing our northern borders. Plague was devastating our cities. Conspiracies threatened political stability, and my own health was declining. My mind constantly raced between painful memories of better times and fearful projections of potential disasters. I was everywhere except where I actually was, in the present moment where real life was happening. I remember sitting in my tent during a particularly brutal winter campaign, surrounded by reports demanding immediate attention, when I noticed something extraordinary. Despite all the chaos swirling around me, in that specific moment I was safe. I was warm. I was breathing. My heart was beating steadily. The actual present reality was far different from the mental torment I was creating by dwelling on past failures and future threats. This observation led to a profound experiment. What if I focused exclusively on what was happening right now, in this very instant? When I did this, most of my suffering vanished immediately. The anxiety about tomorrow's battle existed only when I projected my mind into an imaginary future. The regret about yesterday's tactical mistakes arose only when I dwelt in a past that no longer existed. But here, in this moment, I could think clearly, act decisively, and find peace even amid external turmoil. I began training myself to return repeatedly to the present moment throughout each day. When my mind wandered to past regrets, decisions I wished I had made differently, opportunities I had missed, People I had failed I would gently bring my attention back to what was happening now. When anxiety about future challenges tried to overwhelm me, I would anchor myself in immediate reality, the feeling of my feet on the ground, the sound of my breathing, the specific task at hand. This practice revolutionized my effectiveness as a leader. Previously, I had often been physically present in meetings while mentally rehearsing past conversations or planning future strategies. This divided attention made me less responsive to what people were actually saying and less capable of making decisions based on current realities. When I learned to be fully present, my judgment improved dramatically and my relationships deepened significantly. The present moment also became my greatest teacher. When I paid complete attention to what was happening now, I noticed subtleties that had previously escaped me. I could read the genuine concerns behind advisors' diplomatic language. I could sense the morale of troops from their posture and expressions. I could feel the rhythm of negotiations and know when to press forward or when to pause. I discovered that all real power existed in the present moment. I could not change the past, no matter how much energy I devoted to regret. I could not control the future, regardless of how extensively I worried about it. But in this moment, I could choose my thoughts, direct my attention, speak my words, and take my actions. This was where all genuine influence resided. This law also revealed the futility of postponing happiness and satisfaction. I had spent years believing that I would be content when certain conditions were met, when the barbarian threat was eliminated, when the plague ended, when political stability was achieved. But these conditions were always in the future, which meant my happiness was always deferred. When I learned to find satisfaction in present circumstances, regardless of their difficulty, I discovered a contentment that external events could not disturb. The practice became a form of meditation in action. Whether the first was reviewing military dispatches, meeting with senators, or walking through camp, I would periodically ask myself, where is my attention right now? Am I fully here, or am I mentally elsewhere? This simple question became a pathway back to presence and effectiveness. I learned that the present moment was not just a philosophical concept, but a practical tool for better living. When facing difficult decisions, instead of being overwhelmed by all possible ramifications, I would focus on the information available now and the choice that needed to be made now. When dealing with interpersonal conflicts, instead of bringing past grievances into current discussions, I would address only what was happening in the present conversation. The most profound discovery was that the present moment contained everything necessary for whatever needed to be accomplished. I did not need perfect conditions, complete information, or ideal circumstances. I needed only to be fully present with what was actually before me and respond from that place of centered awareness. Time is an illusion that separates you from your life. The past exists only in memory, the future only in imagination. Reality is always now, and now is where your true power resides. Return to this moment, and you return to life itself. Asterisk, asterisk, the 10th and final law emerged from the deepest suffering I ever experienced, the devastating loss of 7 of my children to disease and circumstance. In that crucible of unimaginable grief, I discovered the most liberating truth of human existence, that while pain is an unavoidable part of life, the suffering we create around that pain is entirely optional. This distinction became the foundation of unshakable inner peace. When my son Lucius Verus died at age 7, I thought the agony would destroy me. The raw pain of loss was like a sword through my heart, immediate, overwhelming, undeniable. But as weeks passed, I noticed that my misery had multiple layers. There was the pure grief of missing my child, which came in waves and gradually softened. But there was also my story about the loss, my beliefs that it shouldn't have happened, that the gods were unfair, that I was being punished, that life was meaningless if children could die so young. This second layer of the story, I told myself, about the pain was creating far more suffering than the loss itself. The grief was natural and necessary. It was love expressing itself through absence. But the mental elaborations I had built around that grief were optional additions that served no purpose except to multiply my misery. I began distinguishing between what I called clean pain and dirty pain. Clean pain was the immediate, unavoidable human response to difficult circumstances, the physical discomfort of illness, the emotional impact of loss, the natural sadness that accompanies disappointment. This pain was temporary, purposeful, and ultimately healing when allowed to flow naturally. Dirty pain was everything I added to clean pain through resistance, story-making, and mental elaboration. When I fought against natural grief, it became depression. When I raged against physical illness, discomfort became agony. When I created meaning stories about why bad things happened, temporary setbacks became existential crises. This insight transformed my relationship with every form of difficulty. When joint pain from long campaigns made riding uncomfortable, I learned to acknowledge the physical sensation without adding mental suffering about unfairness or fears about declining health. The pain remained, but the suffering dissolved. When political setbacks frustrated my plans, I felt the natural disappointment without creating dramatic narratives about failure or worthlessness. I discovered that most human suffering comes not from external events, but from our resistance to those events. A soldier wounded in battle experiences pain, but if he accepts the wound as part of warfare's reality, he heals faster and with less mental anguish than a soldier who rages against his injury as unjust fate. The difference lies not in the wound itself, but in the mental stance toward the wound. This principle revolutionized my approach to imperial responsibilities. The weight of leadership naturally created pressure and fatigue-lean pain that came with the territory. But when I resisted this natural difficulty by wishing I could escape my duties or lamenting the burdens of power, I created additional suffering that served no constructive purpose. When I accepted the challenges as inherent aspects of my chosen role, they became simply part of the work rather than sources of misery. I learned to observe my mental processes during difficult times, asking myself, what part of this experience is unavoidable reality, and what part am I adding through resistance or story-making? Usually, the unavoidable portion was much smaller than the elaborated suffering I had constructed around it. The practice became a form of spiritual surgery, carefully separating necessary pain from optional suffering. When senators criticized my policies, the natural sting of disapproval was clean pain that provided useful feedback. But if I spent days rehearsing defensive arguments or imagining future confrontations, I was creating dirty pain that accomplished nothing except exhausting my mental resources. This law also applied to positive experiences. Just as I could avoid adding suffering to pain, I could avoid adding anxiety to pleasure by worrying about when it would end. When I enjoyed peaceful moments with my family, I learned to experience the joy fully without contaminating it with fears about future loss. Present happiness became more vivid when not clouded by anticipatory grief. The most profound application came in dealing with my own mortality. Aging and eventual death were unavoidable realities, clean pain that required no additional suffering. But when I created mental dramas about unfulfilled ambitions or fears about posthumous reputation, I was adding layers of dirty pain that served no purpose, except to steal peace from my remaining years. I developed a daily practice of examining my suffering to identify which portions were necessary and which were optional. When I caught myself in cycles of mental elaboration around natural difficulties, I would return to the simple reality of what was actually happening versus what I was making it mean. This practice gradually retrained my mind to experience life more directly and with far less unnecessary anguish. The ultimate freedom comes from understanding that you cannot avoid all pain, nor should you try, but you can absolutely refuse to create additional suffering through resistance and story-making. Pain teaches, cleanses, and eventually passes. Suffering serves no master except the ego that creates it. Accept what cannot be avoided, and refuse to add unnecessary suffering to unavoidable pain. This is the path to peace in any circumstance. Asterisk, asterisk. Now that you understand the 10 laws that transformed my soul, let me share the practical discipline that made them real in my daily life. Knowledge without application is merely philosophy. These laws only gained power when I wove them into the fabric of each ordinary day. My daily practice became the forge where abstract wisdom was hammered into living virtue. I began each morning before dawn, in the quiet darkness before the camp stirred to life. This was my sacred hour, when I would sit with my scroll and stylus to write what became my meditations. These were not grand pronouncements intended for posterity, but intimate conversations with my own soul, reminders, corrections, and encouragements that I desperately needed to face each day's challenges. My morning meditation began with Law 9, anchoring myself completely in the present moment. I would feel my feet touching the ground, notice my breathing, and deliberately release any mental residue from yesterday's events or anxiety about today's obligations. Only when fully present could I access the wisdom of the other laws. Next, I would remind myself of Law 3, that virtue was my only true possession. I would ask, what kind of person do I want to be today? How can I express wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline in today's specific circumstances? This question transformed my daily agenda from a list of tasks to a series of opportunities for character development. I would then invoke Law 7, reviewing what lay within my control today and what lay beyond it. I would mentally sort my concerns into these 2 categories, consciously releasing anxiety about uncontrollable factors while clarifying what actions I could actually take. This practice prevented me from wasting energy on impossible tasks, while ensuring I took responsibility for what was genuinely mine to influence. Before entering the day's activities, I would practice Law 2 by contemplating mortality, not morbidly, but as a clarifying tool. If this were my last day on earth, what would matter most? What would I regret leaving undone? This meditation instantly revealed my priorities and eliminated concern for trivial matters that normally consumed attention. Throughout the day, I carried these laws with me like tools in a craftsman's kit. When facing difficult people, I would remember Law 6, our fundamental connection to all humanity, and look for the universal needs and fears beneath their challenging behavior. When confronted with setbacks, I would apply Law 8, asking how is this change serving the larger pattern? What opportunity is hidden within this apparent obstacle? During meetings with advisors or senators, I practiced Law 4 consciously, monitoring my interpretations of their words and expressions. Instead of automatically assuming criticism or plotting, I would consider multiple possible meanings and choose interpretations that served constructive dialogue. This simple practice transformed many potential conflicts into collaborative, problem-solving sessions. When anger arose, which happened daily in the pressure of imperial responsibilities, would implement Law 5 immediately. I developed a specific protocol: pause, breathe deeply, identify the underlying fear or hurt beneath the anger, then respond to the real issue rather than reacting from emotion. This practice saved countless relationships and prevented decisions I would have regretted. Law 1, the sovereignty of my inner citadel, became my refuge during the most challenging moments. When barbarian raids disrupted our plans, when plague reports brought devastating news, when political conspiracies threatened stability, I would retreat to that inner fortress where external events could not reach. From this place of centered calm, I could make decisions based on wisdom rather than panic. My evening practice was equally important. Before sleep, I would review the day through the lens of these laws, examining where I had applied them successfully and where I had forgotten their guidance. This wasn't self-criticism, but honest assessment, general reviewing battlefield, performance to improve future strategy. I would ask specific questions. When did I mistake something uncontrollable for something within my power? Where did I add unnecessary suffering to unavoidable pain? How did my thoughts create my reality today? What opportunities did I miss to practice virtue? This reflection helped embed the lessons more deeply and prepared me to apply them more skillfully. Tomorrow, I also practiced Law 10 during this evening review, carefully distinguishing between clean pain and dirty suffering in the day's experiences. Physical fatigue from long meetings was acceptable. Mental anguish about imperfect decisions was optional and unhelpful. Disappointment about setbacks was natural. Dramatic stories about failure were unnecessary additions. The most crucial element was consistency rather than perfection. I missed my morning practice sometimes. I forgot the laws during stressful moments. I added suffering to pain and let anger control my responses. But I kept returning to the practice, day after day, year after year, like water gradually carving stone. This daily discipline slowly transformed my character. These laws worked together like instruments in an orchestra. Law 9 kept me present enough to apply the others. Law 7 prevented wasted energy that I needed for virtue. Law 5 preserved relationships necessary for effective leadership. Each law supported and strengthened the others through daily practice. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. After years of consistent application, these practices became as natural as breathing. I no longer had to consciously remember to apply them. They had become integrated into my very being. The anxious, overwhelmed young emperor had evolved into someone who could find peace in chaos and strength in adversity. Wisdom without practice remains mere concept. Make these laws your daily discipline, and watch them forge your soul into something unbreakable. Asterisk, the true test of these laws came, not in solitary meditation, but in the complex arena of human relationships. When I applied Stoic principles to my marriage, friendships, and political alliances, I discovered that genuine love, the kind that serves rather than possesses, that strengthens rather than weakens, was not just compatible with philosophical wisdom but required it. These laws transformed every relationship in my life, from source of drama to opportunity for virtue. My marriage to Faustina initially suffered from my misunderstanding of what love truly meant. Like most young men, I had confused love with emotional attachment, possessiveness with care, and romantic intensity with genuine affection. When Faustina made choices I disliked or expressed opinions that differed from mine, I would become upset, as if her independence somehow threatened our bond. This approach created exactly the distance and conflict I was trying to prevent. Everything changed when I applied Law 7 to our relationship, focusing only on what I could control. I could not control Faustina's thoughts, feelings, choices, or development as a person. Attempting to do so was not love, but manipulation disguised as care. What I could control was how I treated her, how I communicated, how I supported her growth, and how I expressed affection. When I focused exclusively on being the best husband I could be, rather than trying to shape her into my ideal wife, our relationship flourished. Law 6, recognizing our fundamental human connection, revolutionized how I approached interpersonal conflicts. When senators opposed my policies or advisors disagreed with my decisions, instead of seeing them as obstacles or enemies, I began looking for the universal human needs beneath their positions. Usually, I found that they wanted the same things I did: security, respect, meaningful contribution, and good outcomes for Rome. Our disagreements were about methods, not fundamental goals. This shift in perspective transformed political negotiations from power struggles into collaborative problem-solving. When I approached opponents with genuine curiosity about their concerns, rather than immediate defensiveness, they often revealed practical insights that improved my proposals. What had seemed like personal attacks were usually attempts to address legitimate issues I had overlooked. Law 5. Understanding anger as weakness became essential for maintaining healthy relationships under pressure. Imperial responsibilities created constant stress that could easily spill over into personal interactions. When exhaustion made me irritable or setbacks triggered frustration, I learned to pause before speaking and ask, what am I really feeling beneath this anger? How can I address the actual issue without damaging this relationship? This practice saved my marriage countless times. When Faustina's social activities conflicted with my preferences, instead of expressing anger about her choices, I would examine the fear or insecurity underneath my reaction. Usually, I discovered that my irritation masked concern about our connection or worry about imperial appearances. Addressing these deeper issues directly led to much more productive conversations than arguing about surface behaviors. I learned to distinguish between attachment and genuine love. Attachment demanded that people remain exactly as they were, that relationships never change, that others fulfill our expectations regardless of their own needs. This attachment created suffering whenever reality deviated from our desires, which it inevitably did. Genuine love, by contrast, wanted the best for others even when that meant accepting changes we found difficult. Law through virtue, as the only true good, taught me that the quality of my relationships depended entirely on the virtue I brought to them, not on what I received in return. A truly loving person remains loving regardless of others' responses. A genuinely loyal friend stays loyal even when friendship becomes challenging. A virtuous leader serves his people whether they appreciate it or not. This understanding liberated me from the exhausting cycle of conditional love that had characterized many of my earlier relationships. Instead of being kind only when others were kind first, I chose kindness as my default mode. Instead of being patient only when others deserved it, I practiced patience as a virtue worth developing regardless of circumstances. Law 4. Thoughts, creating reality revealed how much relationship drama existed primarily in interpretation. When advisors gave me feedback, I could interpret it as helpful guidance or personal criticism. When Faustina seemed distant, I could assume she was angry with me or recognize that she might be dealing with her own challenges. The facts remained the same, but my interpretations determined whether interactions became sources of connection or conflict. I began checking my assumptions directly, rather than creating elaborate mental stories about others' motivations. I notice you seem concerned about something. Would you like to talk about it? Became far more effective than hours of speculation about what someone might be thinking. Most relationship problems, I discovered, were actually interpretation problems. In disguise, the most profound shift came from applying law, distinguishing pain from suffering to relationship challenges. Some interpersonal pain was inevitable: the sadness when friends died, the disappointment when trusted advisors made poor decisions, the grief when children grew beyond needing us. This clean pain was love expressing itself through loss and change. But much relationship suffering was optional: the resentment when others didn't meet our expectations, the drama when people acted according to their nature rather than our preferences, the anxiety about whether others approved of us. When I stopped adding these elaborations to natural relationship challenges, my connections became much more peaceful and genuine. True love, I learned, was not an emotion but a practice, the daily choice to treat others with kindness, respect, and genuine care regardless of their response to us. This love strengthened rather than demanded, served rather than possessed, and found joy in others' growth rather than insisting they remain static for our comfort. Relationships become laboratories. For virtue, when approached with wisdom, every interaction offers opportunities to practice patience, kindness, honesty, and genuine care. Make your love a gift freely given, rather than a transaction requiring payment. Asterisk leadership, I discovered, is not about controlling others, but about mastering yourself so completely that others naturally want to follow your example. The greatest lesson of my reign was that external authority means nothing without inner authority, and that the leader who cannot govern his own soul will inevitably fail to serve those who depend on him. These 10 laws didn't just transform my personal life, they became the foundation of effective leadership that served rather than exploited. My early years as emperor were marked by a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership meant. I believed that being in charge meant having the right answers, making quick decisions, and projecting unwavering confidence. This approach led to exhaustion, poor choices, and growing distance from the people I was supposed to serve. I was trying to lead from ego rather than wisdom, from position rather than character. The transformation began when I realized that the law, one ruling my inner citadel, was prerequisite to effectively leading the empire. If I could not maintain peace within my own mind during crisis, how could I provide stability for millions of citizens? If I could not control my own emotional reactions, how could I expect others to remain calm under pressure? Leadership started with self-leadership, and self-leadership started with inner sovereignty. This insight changed my entire approach to decision. Instead of rushing to judgment based on initial emotional reactions, I learned to retreat to my inner fortress first, examine the situation from multiple angles, consult my deepest values, and then respond from a place of centered wisdom. This process took longer than reactive leadership, but it produced far better outcomes and inspired greater confidence from those around me. Law through virtue, as the only true good became my compass for navigating the countless ethical dilemmas that confronted an emperor. When faced with choices between political expediency and moral principle, I had a clear guide, which option served virtue regardless of personal cost. This standard sometimes led to unpopular decisions, but it built the kind of trust that no amount of cunning or manipulation could create. I learned that people will follow leaders they trust more readily than leaders they fear, and trust comes from consistent demonstration of character rather than displays of power. When I chose justice over convenience, mercy over revenge, truth over flattery, I was modeling the kind of leadership I wanted to see throughout the empire. Others began emulating these choices, not because I commanded it, but because they witnessed its effectiveness. Law's 6-hour connection to all humanity revolutionized my understanding of authority. Instead of seeing myself as fundamentally different from or superior to those I led, I recognized that I was simply a fellow human being who had been given specific responsibilities. This perspective eliminated the arrogance that often corrupts leaders and replaced it with genuine service to the common good. When I approached governance from this mindset of shared humanity, policies became more compassionate and practical. I could better understand how decisions would affect ordinary citizens because I remained connected to my own ordinary human needs and concerns. The emperor who remembered his humanity was far more effective than the emperor who pretended to be more than human. Law 5 as weaknesses was crucial for maintaining relationships with difficult subordinates and political opponents. Leadership constantly presented provocations, incompetent administrators, corrupt officials, rebellious governors, scheming senators. My initial impulse was often anger, which felt like strength but actually diminished my effectiveness and damaged relationships unnecessarily. When I learned to respond rather than react, addressing the underlying issues that triggered my anger, rather than simply expressing displeasure, I became far more influential. A leader who remained calm during crisis inspired confidence. A leader who lost his temper during challenges created additional chaos. The strength to remain centered under pressure was magnetic. Others wanted to learn how to develop that same stability. Law 7. Focusing only on what I could control prevented the paralysis that often overwhelms leaders facing complex challenges. As emperor, I was constantly presented with problems that seemed to require impossible solutions. Simultaneous threats on multiple frontiers, competing demands from different constituencies, limited resources for unlimited needs. When I tried to control outcomes beyond my influence, I became overwhelmed and ineffective. When I focused exclusively on what lay within my power, my own decisions, effort, communication, and example, I became much more effective. I could not control enemy movements, but I could control our military preparedness. I could not control natural disasters, but I could control our relief responses. I could not control others' loyalty, but I could control whether my leadership deserved loyalty. This principle also helped me delegate more effectively. Instead of trying to micromanage every aspect of imperial administration, I focused on setting clear expectations, providing necessary resources, and modeling the standards I wanted others to meet. When subordinates failed to meet these standards, I addressed the specific behaviors within my control rather than trying to force personality changes beyond my influence. Law 4. Thoughts creating reality became essential for maintaining the kind of mindset that inspired others during difficult times. When challenges arose, I had a choice. I could interpret them as evidence of impending doom, or as opportunities to demonstrate Roman resilience and wisdom. My interpretation didn't just affect my own morale, shaped the entire tone of imperial response. Leaders are emotional contagion centers. Whatever energy they project spreads throughout their organization. When I maintained optimism grounded in realistic assessment of our capabilities, that confidence spread to my advisors, generals, and ultimately throughout the empire. When I allowed myself to be overwhelmed by challenges, that anxiety also spread, creating the very conditions I was trying to prevent. The most profound leadership insight was that true authority comes from becoming the kind of person others want to become themselves. When I embodied the virtues I hoped to see in others' wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline created a magnetic effect that drew people toward excellence. They followed not because they had to, but because they were inspired by the possibility of their own transformation. Leadership is not about having power over others, but about having such complete power over yourself that others naturally seek your guidance. Lead first by example, and others will follow by choice rather than compulsion. Looking back across the decades of my reign, I can see clearly the stages through which my soul traveled from the chaos of untrained emotion to the serenity of disciplined wisdom. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was a gradual journey marked by specific milestones, each one representing a deeper integration of these laws into my very being. Understanding this progression can help you recognize where you are on your own path and what lies ahead. The first stage was what I call unconscious suffering. In my early years as emperor, I was completely at the mercy of external circumstances and internal reactions. When things went well, I felt elated but anxious about when the good fortune would end. When challenges arose, I felt overwhelmed and often paralyzed by the magnitude of responsibility. I had no understanding that my inner state was something I could influence, let alone control. During this period, I was like a ship without an anchor, tossed about by every wind of circumstance. Political setbacks triggered deep despair. Military victories created temporary euphoria followed by fear of future defeats. Personal relationships were emotional roller coasters that left me exhausted and confused. I was living completely from the outside in, allowing events to dictate my internal experience. The second stage began with awakening awareness. The gradual recognition that my suffering was not entirely caused by external events, but significantly created by my own mental processes. This awakening came slowly, through painful observation of my own patterns. I began noticing that the same type of challenge could affect me differently depending on my mental state when it occurred. This stage was marked by increasing self-observation but limited ability to change what I observed. I could see myself becoming angry, anxious, or depressed, but I felt powerless to alter these responses. This awareness without control was sometimes more frustrating than unconscious reaction had been. At least in ignorance, I could blame circumstances entirely. With awareness came the uncomfortable recognition of my own role in creating my suffering. The third stage was conscious practice, the deliberate cultivation of new responses through daily discipline. This was when I began writing my meditations, developing morning and evening reflection practices, and systematically applying the 10 laws to specific situations. Progress was slow and marked by frequent failures, but I could see gradual improvement over months and years. During this stage, I often had to consciously remind myself to apply the laws. When anger arose, I would think, remember, anger is weakness. What am I really feeling beneath this reaction? When anxiety threatened to overwhelm me, I would deliberately ask, what part of this situation can I actually control? The laws were still external tools I had to consciously pick up and use rather than natural responses flowing from my being. The fourth stage emerged as integrated wisdom, the point where these principles became so deeply embedded that they operated automatically. I no longer had to remind myself to focus on the present moment. My attention naturally rested in the now. I no longer had to consciously choose virtue over expedience. Virtuous action had become my default response to challenging situations. This integration brought what I can only describe as unshakable peace. Not the absence of challenges, those continued throughout my reign, but the presence of an inner stability that remained constant regardless of external turbulence. I could face military defeats, political conspiracies, personal losses, and physical illness with equanimity because my sense of well-being no longer depended on favorable circumstances. The fifth stage was effortless service, the natural expression of wisdom through beneficial action for others. When the soul is no longer consumed with protecting itself from imaginary threats or seeking satisfaction through external achievements, enormous energy becomes available for serving the common good. My most effective policies and decisions flowed from this stage, when personal agenda had dissolved into dedication to the welfare of all. Throughout this journey, I learned that spiritual development was not linear. There were periods of rapid growth, followed by plateaus, where nothing seemed to change. There were apparent setbacks, when old patterns temporarily reasserted themselves during particularly stressful periods, but the overall direction was always toward greater freedom, peace, and effectiveness. I also discovered that each stage brought its own gifts and challenges. The chaos of the early stage, while painful, contained tremendous energy and openness to change. The awareness stage, though frustrating, built the self-observation skills necessary for all later development. The practice stage, while effortful, developed the discipline that made integration possible. The most important insight was that this transformation was available to anyone willing to undertake the journey with patience and dedication. The 10 laws provided the map, but each person had to walk the path personally. No one could do the inner work for another. but everyone had the capacity to travel from chaos to serenity if they committed to the discipline. Looking at where you are now, can you recognize your current stage? Are you still unconsciously reacting to life, or have you begun to observe your own patterns? Are you in the early stages of conscious practice, or have some principles begun to integrate naturally? Whatever stage you occupy is perfect for beginning the next phase of growth. Your soul's journey from chaos to serenity is not just possible, it is your birthright. Trust the process, embrace the discipline, and allow these laws to transform you from the inside out. Asterisk, asterisk, though I ruled in the 2nd century, the human heart remains unchanged, and the challenges you face today, though different in form, are identical in essence to those I confronted as emperor. The 10 laws that transformed my soul can transform yours, but they must be adapted to your specific circumstances. Let me show you how these ancient principles apply to the modern struggles that rob your peace and diminish your power. Your modern world moves faster than mine did, but Law 9, living in the present moment, becomes even more crucial when technology constantly pulls your attention toward past regrets shared on social media or future anxieties amplified by endless news cycles. The practice remains the same, repeatedly returning your attention to what is actually happening now, rather than the mental constructions of what was or might be. When you feel overwhelmed by information overload, emails demanding immediate responses, or the pressure to be constantly productive, anchor yourself in present reality. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice your breathing. Ask yourself, what actually needs my attention in this specific moment? Most of the urgency that drives modern stress exists only in your mind, not in immediate reality. Law 7, focusing only on what you can control, applies perfectly to the anxieties created by global news, social media comparison, and economic uncertainty. You cannot control market crashes, political decisions, other people's opinions of you, or worldwide events that dominate headlines. But you can control your daily choices, your responses to challenges, your personal growth, and your contribution to your immediate community. Create your own version of my 2-column practice. List what you worry about but cannot influence. Then list what you can actually affect through your actions. Redirect energy from the first list to the second, and watch both your effectiveness and peace of mind increase dramatically. Your workplace politics mirror the imperial court intrigues I navigated daily. Law 6. Recognizing your connection to all humanity transforms difficult colleagues from enemies to fellow humans struggling with their own fears and pressures. When someone seems hostile or unreasonable, ask yourself, what underlying need or concern might be driving this behavior? This approach often reveals solutions that pure opposition cannot discover. Modern relationship challenges, whether romantic, partnerships, family dynamics, or friendships, require the same wisdom I applied to my marriage and political alliances. Law 5 teaches you that anger damages the angry person more than its target. When loved ones disappoint you or conflicts arise, pause before reacting and ask, what am I really feeling beneath this anger? How can I address the actual issue without damaging this relationship? The constant pressure to achieve more, earn more, and appear successful creates the same illusions about happiness that I faced with imperial wealth and power. Law, through virtue, as the only true good, reminds you that your character matters more than your possessions, your integrity more than your reputation, your inner development more than your external achievements. This doesn't mean abandoning worldly goals, but holding them lightly. Pursue career advancement, financial security, and personal achievements while recognizing that these things cannot provide the deep satisfaction that comes only from becoming a person of virtue. Let external goals serve your character development. Rather than allowing character to be sacrificed for external gain, social media and constant connectivity create unprecedented opportunities for law. Forethoughts creating reality to either liberate or imprison you. Every post you see, every news article you read, every comparison you make is an opportunity to practice conscious interpretation. Instead of automatically accepting the stories your mind creates about what you observe, ask, what other meanings are possible? Which interpretation serves my growth and well-being? The fear of death that Law 2 addresses takes modern forms: fear of irrelevance, fear of missing out, fear of aging, fear of failure. The practice remains the same, using mortality awareness to clarify priorities and eliminate concern for trivial matters. When facing difficult decisions, ask yourself, how will this matter on my deathbed? What choice would I be proud to remember in my final moments? Law 8. Embracing change becomes essential in a world where technological advancement, economic shifts, and social changes happen at unprecedented speed. Instead of resisting inevitable transformation, ask, how can I flow with this change? What opportunities does this disruption create? How can I adapt while maintaining my core values? The chronic stress and anxiety that characterize modern life require Law 10's distinction between pain and suffering. Some discomfort is inevitable: work, pressure, relationship challenges, health concerns, financial worries. But much of your misery comes from the stories you create around these natural difficulties: catastrophic thinking, worst-case scenario planning, comparing your struggles to others' apparent ease. Practice separating clean pain from dirty suffering by asking, what part of this difficulty is unavoidable reality, and what part am I adding through resistance or mental elaboration? Accept what cannot be changed, and refuse to multiply necessary challenges with unnecessary drama. Law 1. Ruling your inner citadel provides refuge from the constant external demands for your attention, energy, and emotional reaction. Create daily practices that strengthen your inner sovereignty: meditation, journaling, time in nature, or simply quiet moments where you reconnect with your deepest values and intentions. The specific applications are endless, but the principle remains. Constant external circumstances cannot determine your inner state unless you allow them to. Your peace, happiness, and effectiveness depend not on what happens to you, but on how you choose to respond to what happens to you. These laws worked for an emperor governing millions. They will work for you governing your own life. The only requirement is consistent practice, applied with patience and dedication. Your circumstances may be modern, but your soul yearns for the same timeless wisdom that transformed mine. Asterisk, asterisk, as I write these final words, I feel the weight of years and the approach of my own mortality, yet my soul has never been more at peace. The 10 laws that saved me from the chaos of untrained emotion and untested character have become my greatest legacy, not the territories conquered or the policies enacted, but the wisdom that can outlive any empire and transform any life willing to embrace it. You who have journeyed with me through these principles now possess something more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies, more enduring than monuments. You carry within yourself the capacity for unshakable inner peace, regardless of external circumstances. This is not merely knowledge, it is the seed of transformation that, when planted in the soil of daily practice, will grow into a life of profound meaning and service. I think often of the young emperor the first once was anxious, overwhelmed, driven by forces I did not understand. That man believed his happiness depended on controlling events beyond his power, his worth on achievements that time would erase, his peace on circumstances that constantly changed. He lived in a prison of his own making, surrounded by all the pleasures and powers the world could offer, yet suffering from poverty of the soul. Asterisk, the transformation I underwent is available to you. The laws that freed me from inner slavery can free you from whatever chains bind your spirit. Whether you struggle with anger that damages your relationships, anxiety that steals your peace, or a sense of meaninglessness that darkens your days, these principles offer a path to liberation that no external force can block. But wisdom unused is wisdom wasted. Reading about these laws, understanding them intellectually, even agreeing with them completely, will change nothing unless you commit to the daily practice that makes them real. Philosophy becomes powerful only when it moves from the mind into the heart, from concept into character, from theory into lived experience. I challenge you to begin today. Choose one law that speaks most directly to your current struggles and commit to practicing it for the next month. Notice what happens when you consistently return your attention to the present moment. Observe how your relationships change when you focus only on what you can control. Experience the peace that comes from embracing virtue as your highest good. Do not expect immediate transformation. The journey from chaos to serenity requires patience, persistence, and compassion for yourself when you forget to apply what you have learned. I failed countless times, reverted to old patterns during stressful periods, and had to remind myself daily of principles I thought I had mastered. Progress in philosophy, like progress in any skill, comes through consistent practice over time. Remember that your individual transformation serves something larger than personal happiness. As you develop unshakable inner peace, you become a beacon of stability for others lost in the storm of their own unexamined emotions. As you learn to respond rather than react, you break cycles of conflict that may have persisted for generations. As you choose virtue over expedience, you contribute to the moral foundation upon which healthy communities are built. The legacy you create through inner work extends far beyond your own lifetime. The patience you develop will be felt by your children and their children. The wisdom you embody will inspire colleagues and friends to pursue their own growth. The peace you cultivate will create ripples of calm in a world desperately hungry for authentic tranquility. This is how empires of the soul are built, not through conquest but through example, not through force but through the magnetic power of genuine virtue, not through demanding that others change, but through becoming so transformed yourself that others naturally want to discover your secret. I have shared with you the deepest wisdom I discovered in my years of leading the greatest empire on earth. But the empire that matters most is the one within your own consciousness, and you are its absolute ruler. Exercise that sovereignty wisely. Guard the gates of your mind carefully. Choose your responses consciously. Live as someone worthy of the gifts you have been given. My physical form will return to the elements from which it came. But these laws, if you make them your own through practice, will live on through you and all those whose lives you touch. This is the only immortality that matters. Wisdom passed from soul to soul. Truth preserved through practice. Peace multiplied through example. You came to learn about changing your soul. You now possess the knowledge to accomplish that transformation. The rest is up to you. Make your life a testament to the power of philosophy lived rather than merely studied. Let these laws forge your soul into something unbreakable, and let that strength serve the highest good of all. The emperor's final gift is this: you need no emperor, no external authority, no permission from anyone to begin ruling your inner kingdom with wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline. Your throne awaits. Your empire beckons. Your transformation begins now.